John Keats was one of three second-generation Romantic poets, including Byron and Shelley, in addition to Keats, who had a revisionary relationship to Wordsworth. Each of these three poets worshipped the man. They thought he was indeed the genius of the age, probably the most brilliant poet since Milton. But for various reasons, each of the three poets rebelled. Byron and Shelley, mainly for political reasons. The two young liberal poets were chagrined by how the aging Wordsworth became increasingly conservative. Keats was less troubled by Wordsworth's political affiliations. He was more troubled by what we might call Wordsworth's egotism. Well, there's a backstory to Keats's idea of Wordsworth, and as usual, the backstory is very personal. Keats was keen to meet Wordsworth. Keats knew Benjamin Robert Haydon, a historical painter of the age who was a friend of Wordsworth's. In fact, Haydon was going to include the face of Wordsworth in his grand historical canvas, Christ's Entry into Jerusalem. Haydon also included the face of Keats in that painting, and Lamb's too. Well, Haydon set up a meeting between Wordsworth and Keats, and when the two poets met, they were among a group of people at a social gathering. At some point, someone said, "Hey, young John Keats, why don't you read some of your poetry to Wordsworth?" Now, again, this is 1817. Keats born in 1795, so Keats is very young at this point. He hasn't really done that much in the public eye in terms of poetry. He would be seen as a novice in the very esteemed Wordsworth's eye at this point. Wordsworth, again, born 1770, so Wordsworth is entering into his middle age. Well, apparently Keats recited a part of his long poem Endymion called Hymn to Pan. And after the young Keats chanted the poem, Keats was noted for the chanting way, the half-chanting way it was called, the chanting way in which he recited his poetry. He chanted his poetry walking back and forth in the room, a very dramatic performance. At the end of this, instead of applauding, instead of praising, Wordsworth apparently said, "Ah, a very pretty piece of paganism." To the listeners in that group, this was a condemnation with faint praise. Well, this might be the reason, one of the reasons why Keats eventually came to associate Wordsworth with egotism. He didn't need to have firsthand experience of Wordsworth, certainly, to reach this conclusion. He could simply read Wordsworth's poetry, which, as we know, is almost exclusively about William Wordsworth, or indeed a poetic eye which resembles very closely William Wordsworth, and it recounts experiences we know William Wordsworth to have had, such as lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey, and the Intimations Ode. Well, in his letters and in other places, Keats did associate Wordsworth with a poetic egotism. And for Keats' egotism, Keats, the poet of negative capability, egotism would not have been a compliment. So here's Keats in one of his letters talking about Wordsworth as a poet of egotism, a poet whose ego gets in the way of his writing powerful poetry. This is Keats in February of 1818. It may be said that we ought to read our contemporaries, that Wordsworth and company should have their due from us. But for the sake of a few fine imaginative or domestic passages, are we to be bullied into a certain philosophy engendered in the whims of an egoist? In the whims of an egotist, Every man has his own speculations, but every man does not brood and peacock over them till he makes a false coinage and deceives himself. Many a man can travel to the very bourne of heaven and yet want confidence to put down his half-seeing. Poetry should be great and unobtrusive, a thing which enters into one's soul and does not startle it or amaze it with itself, but with its subject. How beautiful are the retired flowers! How would they lose their beauty were they to throng into the highway crying out, Admire me, I am a violet, dote on me, I am a primrose. So Keats is here saying that Wordsworth's poetry is the equivalent of a flower calling out, please look at me, as if the flower itself were not enough. So when we read a Wordsworth poem about a flower, daffodils say, we ultimately aren't reading about the daffodil, we're reading about Wordsworth seeing the daffodil. Whereas Keats believes that the poem should be about the daffodil. And again, we're going to see this idea show up over and over in Keats, the idea that powerful poetry involves the poet going out of himself and trying to merge imaginatively with the object that is being described. So that's the basic distinction between Wordsworth and Keats. And I think, as we'll see in the negative capability letter, this is also a distinction that would hold between Coleridge and Keats. Keats likened Coleridge to someone who was overly besotted by ideas and as such could not get to things, whereas Wordsworth is a poet drunk on his own ego and therefore can't get to things. Whereas Keats himself wants to get to the thing itself and ultimately become the thing. So the poem is not about Keats seeing something, it's about the something Keats sees.